Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Mr. Spencer and myself, Brad, here to talk with you today about pen testing, specifically in a purple team and red team perspective. And so before we get into it, though, quick admin, if you find this useful, please like, subscribe, rate, share, all of whatever those things mean, because we really like it and it helps us out. This topic, at least for me, comes up a lot, like weekly sometimes. It literally came up today in conversations with a non-technical person. So and it's I don't want to call it a pet peeve, but it's important because words mean things, that we understand what they mean, because, what you ask for is sometimes what you get, and it may not be what you need. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So what are your kind of opening thoughts?
Yeah. So I think this is the same kind of conversation we have when it comes to the differences between pen testing and vulnerability assessments, right? Mm-hmm. We hear those two kind of get confused all the time, but we see and hear a lot of confusion and a lot of conflating between what is a penetration test, what is a purple team exercise, and what is a red team engagement, right? And it's understandable because oftentimes red team and pen test is used to mean the same things out of context, right? But they're very different assessments. They're very different types of engagements. Contributing to that too, Brad, is lack of standardization in the industry, right? You go to one pen testing firm and they're going to call a pen test something, and it might actually be a vulnerability assessment, right? Unfortunately, that does happen in the industry, and because of the lack of standardization and frameworks around these things, we have kind of this conundrum where certain things mean certain things to someone, but different things to other people, if you know what I mean. So the goal of this episode in my mind is to, one, help educate people that are listening on what a pen test is, what a purple team is, what a red team is, help identify what the goals are of each of those engagements, what the differences are, and help people understand at least how we see those things and where those kind of fit into a maturity model for organizations, right? Because like we were talking about before we started, not everyone needs a red team. Not everyone is ready yet for a purple team. And not everyone is ready yet for a pen test either, to be fair. So we want to help kind of articulate what we see those things as being, what those things are to us, and how we, how we introduce those engagements to folks, and some information around those.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the most important takeaway for me from what you just said is that we don't create standards, standardization of terminology and standardization of offerings across our industry. So, I feel like we as representatives of that community kind of own that a little bit, right? We are part of the reason for that confusion. And it's a reason that we view the vast majority of our work in part as user education. And it's like, we have these conversations a lot when we're on sales calls, and we say things like, hey, if you're going to get this work done, here are the things that you need to be on the lookout for, right? You should be asking questions. What methodology are you using? What exactly am I getting? What is the scope of the work? So, I think this falls in line with that.
Yeah. And, we have conversations. I just had a conversation, I think it was last week or the week before, with a client who thought they wanted a red team, right? And they're like, yeah, we want a red team because we saw it in a magazine, or we saw it online, and, or my so-and-so, peer at this other company, they got a red team and they really got a lot of value out of it. So they're like, we want a red team. And then you start asking them and you start digging into it a little bit, and you say, well, have you had a pen test before? And they say, yeah, we scan our systems for vulnerabilities. It's like, let's start there. Let's start with what that means, right? A vulnerability assessment is this. So that's where the education comes in. And we try as best as we can to help clients understand what they want and what they need, and what's right for them from a maturity standpoint, right? Because if we went in, we did a red team for that client, there would be less value achieved from them, right? So we want to help the client, one, protect their organization to the best that we can, and two, help them get real tangible value from the assessments that we perform for them, right? There's no sense in them paying us a bunch of money for them not to get value from that engagement.
Yeah, and on that note, it is a pretty common thing for us to, like you said, we'll get on the phone with the client and they'll say, "Hey, this is what I need," and by the end of it, it's not what they get. And so, yeah, it would be super easy for us to be like, "All right, cool, man, let me take your money," and then at the end of it, what have they gotten? And we talk people. Talking down's the wrong word, but I mean, like, we usually step people back a little bit. Like, hey, you came here asking for an internal pen test, but you said you haven't done an external in 4 years, or you've never done an external. We want you to start there. And so there is that kind of step-by-step maturity process that you need to have, because if you've never done anything and suddenly you want a purple team, dude, it's going to be a bloodbath, right? It's going to be embarrassing and it's going to be not fun because, you just don't get anything out of it.
Yeah, and like we'll talk about, we get to purple teamies, you might not have the capabilities or the infrastructure for that yet, right? You might have an MSP that's kind of handling all that for you, and you've never engaged them in this type of way before. And now all of a sudden you're having to see if you have telemetry for certain techniques, and you have to put, if you don't, maybe you want to implement certain logging, but you can't because your MSP is like some IT provider that does all the administration for you. There's a lot of hurdles that you have to overcome. There's some capabilities that you need in place before that happens.
So let me ask you this, in order to level set, should we first define a pen test?
Yeah. I think that's great. I think that's a great start. My own kind of thoughts around what a pen test is a simulated attack on a computer system, a network, an application, some piece of technology, right? Piece of hardware conducted by a pen tester in order to identify and exploit vulnerabilities that an adversary may use to do harm against that target. So that's kind of ambiguous, in kind of intentionally, right? Because a pen test could be, I'm pen testing a medical device, I'm pen testing an application or a network or a car or whatever that might be, right? So it's intentionally kind of ambiguous to me because of that. But essentially, we're trying to determine what an attacker could do to, obtain unauthorized access to systems or data. Could they exploit a vulnerability to gain access to a network, to destroy or modify data, all things like that. And typically, in my mind, during a pen test, you are exploiting things. You are attempting to, quote unquote, penetrate, the defenses of a network in order to get access to things that are important or sensitive or of value to that organization. So that's how I would frame it. I'm curious how you would, add to that and kind of manipulate that definition.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you nailed it, right? So there are some key elements that I think define pen testing and make that different from other types of security testing, right? We've had, I think, multiple episodes on the differences between like pen testing and vulnerability assessments, and you mentioned that earlier today. And I think the biggest differentiator is that there's a human being trying to break into your environment, right? Whatever it is, right? It could be your Wi-Fi, it could be your refrigerator, it could be your car. Looking at you, Darius. But yeah, I mean, it's a human though, right? And we are using tools to discover and attack the surface of the environment that's in scope. And so could be anything. But yeah, I agree with you. We're enumerating and exploiting.
Yep. And the goals of a pen test are very different from the goals of a pen test or other types of security engagements, right? With a pen test, we're trying to find as many vulnerabilities as we can in a limited time engagement, right? So we have 4 days, a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is. We have a limited time to achieve our goals of finding as many vulnerabilities as we can. We rank them by severity, right? We provide remediation recommendations and, retesting advice and validation. So it's very different. And you'll see as we talk through the different types of testing that it's a very different type of test. And there's different goals associated with those. So that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about the differences between these. They all have different goals. So
yeah, one of the things I'll add to that too, with regards to goals, right, is the deliverable is entirely different. And I think you're about to get into this, so I'm gonna hold until you finish what you're about to say.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna kind of segue into that, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, one of the big things that, because we get this question from clients all the time, like, hey, you're telling me a pen test is going to cost, X number of thousands of dollars, but I can get a vulnerability scan from Nessus for $1,200, right? But here's what you're missing, and this is an important output, an important, we call them artifacts of the work from pen testing, is that we are going to layer vulnerabilities that can be used in sequence or combination to create a larger set of risk for your organization, right? And so we can go look at this system over here. Maybe it bleeds a little piece of information. Maybe this system has a configuration problem. We put those two things together and we can leverage that to launch a pretty convincing attack against your user base. That is the kind of thing we're looking for. That's the kind of thing that requires a human brain, at least until ChatGPT catches up to us, right? But, those are the kind of things you're never going to get in a vulnerability scan.
Yep.
And I'll add to that too, just having eyes on, the super, goofy example I always use is if there's a big red hack me button on the website of an organization, you can scan that website all day. But if it's intended functionality, you're never going to find it. Meanwhile, a human being, a 13-year-old, could load that website up and be like, click. And that's the difference in a pen test and a vulnerability scan, right?
Yep. And that's why, as part of a pen test, you're going to have reconnaissance, right? There's a certain amount of information gathering that the pen tester does to, learn how the application works or how the target is operating, types of things like that. There's vulnerability assessment. There's obviously exploitation, things like that. And all of that ties into what you're saying, which is we're not just finding vulnerabilities just to find vulnerabilities, right? We're finding vulnerabilities that present risk of that present risk of things that could adversely impact the organization, right? Yeah. And like you said, the outcomes are risks to the organization, to the firm, things that could material impact you in your ability to operate, to do business, could affect your reputation, all things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. I was actually just thinking when you started down that road was like reputational risk. Good luck finding that in Nessus, bro.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And, one of the things that we do that's very common is we look at, and this is very common in law firms, right? They have everyone listed on their website. This is also common with universities. I want to speak to that.
Big fan. Big fan.
Yeah. So with law firms, law firms are very proud of their attorneys and their staff, right? They want to prominently place them on the website with a really nice picture. And that's fine. That's not inherently a risk, right? But it does provide us as an attacker as some information that we can use to kind of target individuals, right? We get their email, their phone number, the university or college they went to, the law school they went to. We get a lot of information from that we can use to target that organization and those individuals. Same thing with universities. We were doing a pen test just this week, and we're like, you know what? We're going to do some OSINT on the athletic teams, because the athletic teams
such a great story.
Yeah, the athletic teams, a lot of times, they're very proud of the athletes. Maybe it's a very prestigious school or like a D1 school, and a lot of the athletes will go on to pro sports and things like that. But they have, their birthday and their favorite food and their favorite TV show, and all of this information about them that, by the way, could be used as security question or answers to security questions, but they can be used to social engineer as well. And without getting into too many details, right, that can be used to social engineer those organizations out of information or to doing things that you want based on that public information.
Yeah. That was an interesting story, and it worked, right? It worked.
Yep.
In this particular case, and
yep.
And that's not the last time that's happened either, or sorry, not the first time. There have been multiple occasions where, one of the things that we do on pen testing, and this is another great example of a differentiator between other systems and services in pen testing, is we go out and we extract metadata from PDFs online, right? And so there was an engagement that we did. This has been a number of months ago. I want to say it was 2023. It's not important, but we extracted a whole bunch of users out of the PDFs that they were hosting on their website. And then we took those users and their information and we went to LinkedIn. We pulled up their information, and one of the ladies was like executive of communication or something like that. We're like, cool. So if I call the help desk, I now have a ton of information about this lady, right?
Yeah.
And now I know her internal username because that was captured in the PDF when it was generated on her desktop, which, by the way, we got the system name and everything that you can imagine from a metadata perspective. And we have a great deal of information about her. Again, good luck finding that and making those correlations with an automated tool. So
exactly. And, let's not confuse anything. A lot of this can be automated. Right. We can automate the scraping of stuff. We can automate some of the OSINT and the reconnaissance and stuff like that. But what matters and what you're talking about is important for this discussion is the context is what matters, right? Putting the pieces together of the puzzle or creating kind of a target package, right? For who I want to go after to social engineer to gain access to that organization. The context matters. And that's what an attacker is going to do. And that's why a pen test is what it is, and that's why we do those things in a pen test.
Agreed. 100% agree with that.
Cool. So a purple team. That's kind of the next on the list. And we did want to talk about maturity just briefly. And we'll talk, I'm sure, talk about it again and touch on it again. But from a maturity standpoint, right, we think external is like, the starting point. Internal is kind of the next milestone, I would say. And then purple team is kind of after that. Once you've done an internal pen test, you're doing vulnerability assessment, you have some sort of monitoring capabilities like a SIM, you're capturing some of those logs and you're creating alerts from those, or you have a SIM and you're kind of ingesting those things, or maybe you even have an MSP that's helping you do that. That at that point, when you're capable and have some instant response processes, then it's a good time to do a purple team and start figuring out where your gaps are in those processes. So that's kind of where I think about maturity, but I don't know how your thoughts, Brad, on kind of maturity of these three.
I agree, right? I agree with your order, external, internal, purple team. And maybe even, multiple externals and multiple internals before you get there. And the reason that I say that is this, right? The goal is different for each one of those, and we're working in order of likelihood. In other words, what's the probability of you getting attacked from outside your network? Well, it's 1,000,000%, because it's already happening right now. Somebody is scanning your network. If they find 3389 open, inevitably, and I think somebody told me this last year. Didn't one of us stand up a lab?
I did.
Within it was you. Yeah.
Yeah. It was just a couple of months ago. So I'm testing, a password spraying tool. So I create my own OWA instance, right? And I've got on the internet and I've got Exchange on the internet. I turn on RDP and all that. And yeah, within minutes, I was getting brute forced. I'm like, boom. It's like 7 minutes. Like how?
Right. So, but that perfectly illustrates the point that, are you going to be attacked from outside? Absolutely. Within 7 minutes, apparently. And so, let's look at that first. Let's look at your external attack surface. Let's go make sure you don't have, the admin interface to your Cisco ASA on the public internet. Right. And so from there, we go to the internal, right? This is the next most likely avenue of attack, right? Is Jimmy clicks on a link. I'm picking on some guy named Jimmy, poor guy, clicks on a link, and boom, we got malware on his endpoint. How good is the endpoint? How good are the fences and the rails that keep, risks on that endpoint? Can we move laterally? Can we move horizontally? I did that backwards, but the point is this, right? That's a likely scenario. It happens every single day to thousands of organizations all around the world. So let's go there next. Once we feel like we have our external kind of hard shell configured the way we want, let's go look at that GUI center and make sure that it has the right controls, because when we get to that purple team, hold on, let me start over. An internal pen test, and you can probably say words better than me on this, but the goal there is to determine if you have adequate controls and then evaluate those controls for effectiveness. Mm-hmm. If you haven't done that yet, you don't need to do a purple team, because what are you purple teaming? Which I guess we're about to define what that is. So that'll probably help the audience a little bit, but you do need to do these in order. I just took the long road to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, purple team is that next step on the maturity. And, I see purple teaming as a collaborative full knowledge assessment. Mm-hmm. It involves cyber threat intelligence, it involves the red team, the offensive team doing the testing, and then the blue team or the defenders, right? Maybe you're on the blue team, whoever's listening. But during a purple team exercise, you are the red team, the offensive security team, is emulating a real threat, right? Like a real adversary, and that information is obtained from the cyber threat intelligence team. They've identified, a threat or a series of threats that are specific to your industry, to your vertical, to where you operate, the regions that you're in, etc. So it combines the red team, the cyber threat intelligence. They're emulating those attacks, those TTPs, tactic, techniques, and procedures, right? The real threat actor, hands on keyboard stuff that they're doing. At the same time, the blue team is watching what's going on. They're probably watching the screen in real time, watching how these attacks work to get an understanding of them. And they're looking at, their SIM, they're looking at their logs and alerts, and they're looking to identify those attacks in real time and respond to those in real time. And the goal really is to identify, test, and measure how well our people, process, and technology are, right? And the ultimate goal is materially improving the security of the organization right then and there, hopefully, or within a very short period of time. And, how that typically works is you would perform an attack, and the defenders or the blue team would say, yeah, we saw that. We have the log. We see an alert. It's this severity. It means this. And then you move on to the next technique. And you do that for each and every technique so that you determine what your coverage is for these attacks, right? If you execute, 56 attacks and, 47 of them were detected, well, you still have some room for improvement there. There's still some things you need to work on to identify and to detect. So that's kind of how I think of purple teaming, how I would frame in that conversation.
I agree. And if we want to look at the material difference, because between an internal pen test and a purple team, because I think those are the two closest things that we could compare. The big difference is if we look singularly at a control, let's say your endpoint, your EDR, right? And so, for those of you that are unfamiliar with EDR, it's like modern antivirus, and it's an endpoint security tool, endpoint detection and response. And so if we just want to look at that one control, okay, in an internal pen test, we're going to turn it off, right? No, we're not going to ask for it to be turned off. Spencer is going to hack it. Like, he is going to find a way to undermine it. He's going to get it out of the way, and he's going to move forward with his mission in that internal pen test. If we're doing the same thing in a purple team, we're going to say, hey, I'm about to try to turn off your EDR. And it's the most Matrix thing you've ever seen, right? There's some blue team guy and there's logs, scrolling across his screen, and he's like, okay, try it. And then, Spencer hits the button and it turns off, and he's like, I didn't see anything. And we're like, boom. Right. And so that's what we're trying to do in a purple team environment. It's a lot slower paced, and it's very specific, as you alluded to. We're looking at a threat actor, his or her TTPs, and we are implementing those in a step-by-step fashion to evaluate. And it's a lot less, I should say, it's a lot more gray than than an internal pen test. And so what I mean by that is, were you able to bypass EDR, yes or no? That's what you're going to get in an internal pen test in the report, right? We're going to cover the methods and all that good stuff. In a purple team, it could be, were logs generated? It could be, was an action detected? Was an action blocked? Right? And how was your response to that?
Yep.
And those are all four varying levels of success or failure that could occur on a single, TTP.
Yep.
So it is a much more involved, much more, detail-oriented process.
So on internal, we're not necessarily creating a threat profile. We're not necessarily creating a roadmap for the TTPs that we're going to use. We're kind of doing it ad lib or ad hoc. We're kind of reacting to the environment that we're presented with at the time, right? Maybe there's a certain EDR product installed, and we know that dumping LSAS this way doesn't get detected, so maybe we'll choose to do that. Or maybe we, at the end of the test, what I like to do is I like to do things that are noisy. So I will intentionally cause alerts and stuff like that. But on a purple team, we want to try as many variations of the technique as are necessary based on the threats that the organization is facing. So the example that you provided, if I'm going to try and turn off the EDR, maybe there's several ways to do that. Well, we want to look at each of those ways and say, did we see it? Do we have logs for it? Did we alert? And then what's important is we want to try and enable or improve those defenses. So maybe in this case, we're going to turn on tamper protection or tamper alerts or configure some notification when something, some EDR process gets terminated, or implement something to get some logs from those actions. And then we'll go back and we'll try those things again, right? This is also applicable to things like dumping credential material from memory, right? If I'm trying to dump LSAS, well, there's a number of different ways you can do that. You can dump LSAS. You can dump LSAS using Task Manager. You can use various open source tools that people have created to do it that dump LSAS in a number of different ways. You can copy the SAM Hive. There's a number of different ways to get credential material. So we want to test all those things, figure out if we have any gaps in detection and prevention for those, implement those controls, those detections, and then retest those things again to make sure that we have coverage for those things. And like I said, the difference between a pen test and a purple internal pen test and a purple team is we're in real time trying to materially impact and improve security and improve the defenses right then and there, and then move on to that next technique. So, and that's why the threat intelligence piece is important, to make it applicable to your industry, to your vertical, to the type of business that you do, the regions that you're in, the threats that are threat actors, the groups that are targeting you.
Yep, agreed. And it's also one of the reasons, there are many, but it's one of the reasons that we have threat intel capabilities, right, with Victor on our team. Is for that ability, because it is so critical in the context of this type of exercise. So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, because a financial institution, the threats and the adversaries that are targeting financial institutions will be different than a manufacturing organization or a water treatment plant or something like that. They're going to have the different threats. Some of them will be there'll be overlap, right? But there'll be different groups and different adversaries that are targeting those, and they'll have different TTPs. So that's why it's important.
Agreed. So I think the big question that I would have is, all right, cool. So I think I understand what a purple team is. How does that compare to a red team? Because arguably one of them just doesn't have blue in it. Right? Am I wrong? I mean,
sure. So
dad joke for you there, folks.
Yeah. So a red team is sometimes referred to as attack simulation or attack emulation, something like that. As a matter of kind of just definition and language, I would call a purple team an emulation, like a threat emulation, and a red team I would call a simulation. If we want to get like really specific, a red team to me is you're simulating a sufficiently advanced or sufficiently motivated or sufficiently skilled attacker that is going after a specific target. They're using specific TTPs, and they're trying to achieve some specific goal, right? Mm-hmm. And the goal of a red team usually is to simulate a motivated attacker who is assessing, or in this case, we would be assessing the controls and the response capabilities of the organization. So we want to test how effective the controls are and how well the response capabilities are. So we're going to do a lot of the same things we would do in a pen test, right? We're going to do recon, we're going to do OSINT, but there's going to be things that are out of scope for a pen test that we would do in a red team. For example, a lot of times our pen tests are not full scope in that we don't include social engineering or spear phishing or physical attacks where we're trying to
fight somebody in the parking lot,
fight somebody in the parking lot, or con our way into the building and plug a USB stick in for initial access. We're not going to necessarily create customized malware for that environment. A lot of times on a pen test, we're using off-the-shelf stuff. So there's going to be a lot of differences with a red team, and a red team is kind of not necessarily the end goal, but that is the I would say the highest level of maturity for an internal assessment, and even to some extent the external as well. but it's going to be a different in those ways. And that's kind of how I would start to describe that is a simulation. We're targeting specific things. The organization has specific goals like, hey, I want you to try to get to this SQL database. I have a flag here. I want you to get to that and show me that you can get access to that, how you would get access to that, and how we can fix those gaps.
Sure. And I'll offer an example of a red team that I did a couple of years ago. I say a couple, it might've been longer than that now, but it was with a bank, and the flag was domain administrator, right? And they were like, I don't care, gloves off. We're not telling the blue team, and you do whatever you have to do to gain access to that. And so, I think the thought of the executive, it was a risk executive that was sponsoring the program, was like, you're going to try to hack in, and it's going to take you a couple of days. And so like literally the next morning we put on a maintenance outfit, grabbed a clipboard, walked straight into the front door of the data center. And we literally, followed a person all the way into the server room. And one of the machines, the KVM console, was unlocked with domain administrator logged in. And so, it was an hour and a half into the very first day of the exercise, and we called them. We're like, hey, Rich, man, what's next? You want us, you got us for a couple more days. You want to do some more stuff. But that is an example of what I would expect on a red team. It's not common these days. We have better security now, but those are the kind of gloves off scenarios. There will be guardrails inevitably, like you can't kidnap people in most red team engagements. But generally speaking, like you said, it's more target oriented, and it's generally a larger scale, like a larger scope of options that you can execute.
Yeah, definitely. It's usually, like a full scope thing where you can social engineer, you can spearfish, you can, attack wireless networks, you can maybe walk into the building, like you said, and plug a USB in. You're going to be, doing a lot of reconnaissance in OSINT, right? One of the other primary differences between a red team, a purple team, and a pen test is the length of the engagement, right? Typically for red team engagements, you have a much longer runway for the engagement. We're talking, 2, 3, 4 months at a time, type of engagements. Whereas a pen test is going to be a week, 2 weeks, or 3 days, something in between. A purple team as well, 3 days, 5 days, something like that. Not a very long time period. Whereas a red team, like I said, you're going to be in an environment. You have to learn how the organization operates, maybe find people to target. You want to blend in, right? The goal of a red team is to go unnoticed, to bypass defenses, to achieve a specific goal, and test the organization's response to a sufficiently motivated attacker.
Sure.
Right. And
you're going to be doing things like, on a similar red team engagement where we were doing physical stuff too. We were able to get a picture of what their ID badges looked like, because they had a group picture, like a department picture posted on Facebook, and all of their tags were facing forward. So we were able to emulate the appearance of the physical access tags, the RFID tags, on that engagement. And we ended up not being able to use it, but just those are the kinds of things, that are on the table.
Yeah. And, another goal of a red team engagement is to train the blue team, to train the defenders in their incident response processes. So if they pick up on some suspicious activity on an endpoint, how well defined is their response process? Maybe they investigate it and, they kind of rule it out as a false positive, and, the red team kind of goes unnoticed. Or maybe they do find it and they find that initial, malicious payload, or that initial C2, and they're able to remediate that. But now the red team unknowingly has persistence on another machine, and they're right back in, right? So you can help the organization identify those gaps and say, well, you identified this, you did a good job triaging that, you found the beachhead, but you didn't look outside of that or find the indicators elsewhere, and we had persistence here, and we were able to continue the operation. It's going to look very, very different from a pen test in that regard as well.
Oh yeah, I agree. Excellent. So yeah, I mean, I think that summarizes, my thoughts. They are very different, and even though we in the industry sometimes use these terms interchangeably, what we've given you guys today is, a boiled down, very specific, set of parameters. So, you use this in however you would normally communicate, right? If you're out seeking services, this should help you ask for the right thing. And if you are if you're involved in these types of things, let's try to get on the same page with regards to terminology. Well, folks, that's all that we have time for today. If you enjoyed this, please share with your colleagues and associates. That's the best way you can help us out, by spreading the word. And we will talk to you next Wednesday.